everybody, and welcome to another episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish. I'm your host, Grant Pemberton, and on today's broadcast, it's just me and Ken, and we're talking about something we touched on a couple episodes ago, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the idea of a coming, hopefully, new Reformation to the Western Church. So, Ken, you're coming to us from Morningstar, is that right?
That's it. Yep.
And we're both really super prophets this week.
Yeah.
As I'm in a James Gall thing, and you're in a Morningstar thing, and so this should be a very impressive podcast.
I guess we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, thanks for joining us. I'm just checking the levels here. What's on your mind about this this coming Reformation? I know you and I have talked multiple times. I think most people are aware that the church ain't doing that great. So what are your thoughts on it?
Well, so as we're recording this, today is April the 22nd, 2021. And for those who are historically attuned, that would mean 4 days ago was the 18th of April. And it was on the 18th of April, exactly 500 years ago, that Martin Luther famously said to the papal legate and to the inquisitor, "Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God." And with that, all avenues of appeal had been closed. Luther faced death at a stake for being a heretic. And it wasn't even so much about his theology. I mean, certainly the Catholic Church had issues with his theology, but it was because of his unwillingness to yield to the authority of the Pope. And so this really triggered the Protestant Reformation. There were a lot of things going on inside the Protestant Reformation, and most Christians today the concepts are very fuzzy in their mind. I mean, they sort of know maybe broadly something about the Bible and salvation by faith, but most people would not be able to talk very clearly about what were the issues at stake in the Reformation. So the first Reformation, the one 500 years ago, it was founded on a recovery of the doctrine of salvation by faith through grace alone. And so with this, the reformers had these sayings, sola gratia, sola fide, which is just Latin, which means by grace alone and by faith alone. And they had a third sola, which was sola scriptura, meaning only what's in the Bible. And this was important because there were a lot of things that were going on that were believed to be right, that were, I would say, part of the common practice of Christians of that time, but they weren't necessarily biblical. They were just what people did. And I think we have that going on in our time as well. There are a number of practices that even within Protestant Christianity, those who read the scriptures carefully and take them seriously would raise their eyebrows at some of the things that are being said and done within the context of modern Christendom. Luther had nailed 95 theses or charges or points of disputation to the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany, or Wittenberg, if we say it with a proper German pronunciation. And so these were areas, things that were wrong, that needed attention. And the thing that had actually triggered Luther's rage was not what you might think. It didn't actually have as much to do with these doctrines of salvation by grace through faith. I mean, certainly that was there. I wouldn't want to deny that. That would be wrong. But there was one particular practice. There was a man named Johannes Tetzel who was going around raising money for the building of St. Peter's Basilica, the very one that you can go see today in Rome, that is the Vatican. And as Tetzel was going around, there was a doctrine, one that cannot be substantiated from our scriptures, of purgatory. And so again, we think of things that are not even biblical that become controlling paradigms and memes in a given time frame. in Luther's time, it was this thing of purgatory. And so the idea was that if you died and you hadn't been shriven, which is an older term that means you essentially had your sin sheared away from you or removed from you. If you'd not been shriven, you would go to purgatory. And in purgatory, you would go through a process of rogation or purification. And when you emerge, then you'd be ready to enter paradise. But purgatory was a long and slow and painful process, essentially like a low-grade hell where you were tortured until you were deemed to be pure enough to go to heaven. Now, for anybody who understands the doctrine of grace, the idea that, you believe and you are forgiven because of that belief, you kind of scratch your head and go, where did this come from? And the answer is, it didn't come out of the Bible. But it had, there were reasons why in the reasoning of human beings that they felt they needed to create this intermediate state. And so Tetzel's famous saying, it rhymes in German and it also rhymes in English, which is convenient. But Tetzel was going around raising money for St. Peter's Basilica, and his rhyme was, when the coin into the box rings, the soul out of purgatory springs. And so people were giving huge quantities of money in order to buy freedom for their departed loved ones from purgatory that they could pass on to the blessed life of heaven. And Luther was outraged by this. He was like, what are you doing? You're selling the gospel in order to build a building. And when you think about some of the excesses that have periodically characterized modern Christianity, huge building projects, people buying lavish things. I don't want to be too specific. I don't want to appear to be throwing brickbats at anybody. But, it really makes us want to think a bit about, what are we doing with the realm of money? I mean, obviously, we need money to buy buildings and to buy air conditioning and toilet paper and keep the lights on. And so on the one hand, there needs to be something. But, if you've been to St. Peter's Basilica, it's a rather magnificent edifice. And so Tetzel was raising all of this money. And so really, it was the outrage over that got Luther thinking about, well, how are we actually saved? And what does the Bible actually teach? And because Luther was, a literate man, not all were in those days, he could actually go back to the Bible and read it. And the more he read, the more he realized, wait a minute, we're teaching all kinds of stuff that is not, it's not, excuse the term because we're talking about Catholicism, but it's not kosher.
Right.
And so that was really what set it off. And, for a long time, there were reverberations around Europe. In fact, this morning at breakfast, I was sitting with some people talking about the time of sorrows in Ireland. And this only ended maybe 20 years ago. But this was when the Catholics and the Protestants were fighting each other still in Ireland at the turn of the 21st century. So it had been nearly 500 years since the Reformation, when that all ended. As I said, just 4 days ago was the 500th anniversary of Luther saying, "Here I stand, I can do no other." He'd nailed those 95 statements of contention, or theses, as they're commonly called, the 95 theses to the Wittenberg church door on Halloween, October 31st, 1517. So it had taken 3.5 years to get to this place that we just crossed the boundary of, to come to a full and rolling boil at that point. And this really began the period of religious wars in Europe. So if we understand that the Christianity of Luther's time was sclerotic, it was certainly not really having an impact on the wider society. The state of holiness was very low. The state of consecration to the purposes and things of God. Sure, some people went into what they called the religious life. They became monks, they became nuns, they became friars. Some became priests, which is at that time the equivalent of our pastors. So there were people who did this, but the state of the society was itself a mess. And there were all kinds of things that were going on. In fact, when the Reformation really got underway, one of the things that used to happen is, so Europe split into factions. You had the Protestant areas, you had the Catholic areas, And woe befall you if you were a Protestant in a Catholic area or a Catholic in a Protestant area. It might not end very well for you and your family. I mean, literally, you might be killed. You might have your house burned down. You might be driven from where you lived with nothing but the clothes on your back. I mean, you just didn't really know. It was a very, very difficult time. And it was one of the reasons, by the way, coming into the early founding of America, that the founding fathers in the 1700s did not want to have a state religion. They didn't want the government of the United States endorsing, say, Catholicism over any branch of Protestantism. And by the time of the founding of the American Republic, we have, at least in America, we have some Catholicism, we have Anglicanism, or the Episcopal Church is what it became known as, but that's the U.S. branch of the Anglican Church at that time. Today, by the way, there is also what they call the Reformed Anglicans, or the Anglicans of North America, that are more closely aligned with the Church of England because of the great errors and decay that's going on in American Episcopalianism. So there's been some things going on in that sphere. But at the time I'm describing, in early America, there was only the Episcopal Church. There were some Lutherans, which are principally Germanic and Nordic. And then there were the Methodists, which were, a reformist movement within Anglicanism. These would have been the primary denominations in America. There were some Baptists around as well, coming out of the Reformation period. But this is kind of the religious landscape in America. But one of the things that they all recognized was that we don't want to have bloodshed in America, because the government is advocating for one branch of Christianity over the other. And so when we talk about freedom of religion per the First Amendment, it's given and assumed that it's the Christian religion. And so the question is not Christianity versus Islam or Judaism or Hinduism or Buddhism. The question is really which branch of Christianity. And so when we say that the government shall make no establishment of religion, what they really mean is the government can't pick sides among Catholics or any of these various branches of Protestant. It has to remain neutral in regard to all that. And it's important for us to emphasize this, because I think in our time, separation of church and state has become such a shibboleth that people think it means the government can't have any involvement at all with church matters, nor can the church be involved in or speak into the matters of the state. And in fact, that's not the way the early founders understood it. They just didn't want them persecuting one piece of Christianity over against another because the person who was president at a given time happened to subscribe to one denomination versus another. It's a very, very important understanding and very important distinction that is typically not understood at all. And the reason it's so important is it proves conclusively that the early founders understood this to be a Christian nation, a nation founded by Christians, among Christians, and albeit imperfectly executed, I think we all know that, but with the objective of trying to live out the principles that are found in the Bible in every sphere of life. And so with that understanding, we move forward into the American experiment. Well, we're, roughly a quarter of a millennium into that, 250 years, round numbers. But as we look at the landscape today, in our time, Christianity is dying in the Western world. And, we recently had William Wood on the show, and I was pushing him a little bit on this point, and he was talking about the signs of hope that he sees and how there are actually signs of revival. And I think it's important that we keep that in mind. We're not supposed to give up hope. Jesus said, when these things begin to happen, you should look up, lift up, for your redemption draws near. So we should be encouraged and excited as we see the signs of the end of the age, as we see the signs of the coming of the end of time. These are all incredibly positive things that are going on, even in the midst of negativity and darkness. And so I think, one of the key things we have to think about as we start discussing a new Reformation is, I think for a lot of people, they've picked up the understanding through the years that there's going to be this huge, great visitation of God, and the church is going to rise up and take over. This is dominionism, and it's closely tied to another doctrine known as amillennialism, that there is no millennium on earth at all. In fact, we create the millennium. We, the Christians, create the millennium. And all I can say is, if that's the reality, boy, am I disappointed. Because, despite the American experiment, we haven't managed to bring in the millennium. And one of the great hopes of liberal Christianity, of especially roughly 100 years ago, among these very mainstream denominations that I was describing, one of their great hopes was that we would somehow create heaven on earth. They didn't use that language. They were talking more about utopia, and they were talking about social reformation and that sort of thing. But that grand experiment fell over and failed as well. And so, our hope is actually in the coming of the kingdom of God. And the early Christians understood that there would be a return of Jesus with an eschatological inbreaking, an end of time kind of scenario, and he would set up an earthly throne on the earth. I'm not saying we shouldn't labor for justice. I'm not saying that we should abandon all efforts to rectify the misery of humanity through whether it's hospitals or feeding programs or education or drilling of water wells. I'm not saying we should abandon any of that. I'm just saying that we need to be really clear that none of that is actually the kingdom of God.
I think as I'm hearing you talk about it, it's like, where are we putting our hope? Is our hope in that we're going to fix, raise the poor up and all of that sort of thing? Or is our hope in Jesus, right? I mean, he's going to do it. And we can help, we can do a lot of things, but it has to do, and it seems like a kind of a semantics on some level, but I think it's so important that someone recently said, if you preach revival all the time, all you'll get is disillusionment. But if you preach Jesus, you just might get revival, because it's sort of, I mean, he's everything,
Right.
And so I think that's what I hear you saying. I mean, of course we're supposed to help the poor, but Jesus even says, hey, they're always going to be around.
That's right.
But it's him. He said, you only have me for so long. He's the focus.
So, one of the things that's interesting about the Vineyard movement, which, you're a Vineyard pastor, John Wimber was unique in his time, because he absolutely believed in preaching Jesus, and he was, I would say, a rock-ribbed evangelical in terms of his fundamental beliefs. And yet he was very passionate about his burden for the poor. And, he was always pushing people, whether it was be in the jails, which was kind of where I thrived in terms of my engagement with social matters, whether they were down at the park feeding the homeless, whether they were working in a warehouse, handing out, say, clothing and bags of groceries to those who might come needing some assistance. In whatever sphere you do it, the expectation was that, we would be engaged in something of a social sort. And really, that kind of emphasis was more what you would have expected to find from the magisterial Protestant churches in the 20th century and early 21st century, those who were the scions of the Methodist and Presbyterian comes along. I forgot to mention them in my early listing of denominations, but the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, all of those mainline denominations, what we call mainline or mainstream churches, they were all, by the early 20th century, very much engaged in the social effort, but they weren't so sure about this preaching of Jesus. And a lot of them had questions about things like the virgin birth and the bodily resurrection of Christ. And they certainly were not in any way interested in the Jewish roots of Christianity, or the fact that Jesus was the fulfillment of the promises to the line of David, the house of David, that there would always be a ruler to sit on the throne. American Christianity had very little interest in this kind of conversation. They were really, by the early 1900s, they were very much about social matters and salvation through social action. And so as we look at the landscape today, there are those that are called not always kindly SJWs, or social justice warriors. And so they're all about social justice. And it has some of those same emphases in it. Nowadays, of course, they've thrown race into it and some other matters as well, perhaps some discussion around gender and human sexuality. But all of this is really just a recapitulation of the very spirit of liberal Christianity from the early 20th century. And it was around 3 or 4 years ago, I was talking to the leader of a major mainstream denominational seminary. And I said to him, you mark my words, just as there was a split within American Christianity in 1920. And 1920 is a watershed year in the history of American Christianity. Just as there was a split in 1920, there will come a split around 2020. So I was giving him kind of a 3-year forward look in American Christianity between those who want to preach the fundamentals of the faith, and those who stayed with that in the early period were called fundamentalists. And then on the other side, we had the liberal social action Christians, and they kind of went in their other direction. And that really became the genesis of the landscape that we are in today. In our time, we are literally living out the effects of a split that happened within American Christendom 100 years before. So in 1920, when that split happened, the thing that was really the defining moment was a man named J. Gresham Machen left Princeton Theological Seminary with some colleagues, and they went down to Philadelphia from Princeton, New Jersey. It's not very far. It's about an hour's drive today, perhaps an hour and a half. Would have been a little longer in those years because the roads weren't as good, but but it's still, within a day's journey. And they founded Westminster Theological Seminary, and Westminster still exists, and so does Princeton. So the people at Westminster were all about the fundamentals of the faith. They wanted to teach the foundational doctrines of the faith. And the people at Princeton, representing the liberal wing, they were all about this social justice effort. And of course, nobody can really preach the gospel without remembering the poor. Paul even says that when he went up to Jerusalem to meet with Peter, James, and John, those reputed to be pillars, he said they extended the right hand of fellowship when they saw the grace that had been entrusted to Barnabas and me. All they asked was that we continue to remember the poor, the very thing I was eager to do. So the evangelical Paul the apostle was seriously interested in the matter of alleviating the misery of the world and engaging in something for the benefit of the poor. And of course, everybody would remember from the book of Acts that the apostles themselves, meaning Peter, James, John, and whoever else there were of the 12 that were there in Jerusalem, but Peter, James, and John are the ones that get named all the time. They had appointed 7 men to be the deacons who would care for the needs of the widows and the poor among them in their community. So they too had a very strong interest in engagement with social matters. But they said, but it would be wrong for us to abandon the preaching of the word for this. So we're going to give that over to these 7 men. So it's clear from the witness of Scripture that people who are, I'll say, conservative Christians need to be engaged on some level in some way with matters of the misery of the world around them. It's not enough merely just to preach good news. On the other hand, having said all of that, if we look at the liberal churches, they may be doing all kinds of things with their soup kitchens or their initiatives against nuclear weapons, or nowadays it's advocating for LGBT rights or racial equity or whatever it may be. If we abandon the preaching of the gospel and the fundamental truths of the gospel, thus the word fundamentalist, then our Christianity is the poorer, because we're actually not preaching the gospel at all. We're simply a religious form of a social service agency. And arguably, the government does a better job of delivering social services than the church anyway, because they have more resources, and they tend to send their people to places like the Kennedy School of Government or Princeton's School of Public Affairs. And so out of that, you get people who are educated, trained, skilled at being public administrators and leaders. And again, because of the greater resourcing available through the tax base, arguably the government can do a better job of addressing these things than the church can. And yet the church, finds itself trying to compete with the government in the social services sector, and without any real message of salvation. And so that left wing end of the church, they've got a different problem, but it's still a problem. So anyway, we end up with this split, and all of the liberals go into the World Council of Churches and the National Council of Churches, and the evangelicals form the National Association of Evangelicals. And they're doing different things, and they both need to be doing something of what the other is doing.
Mm.
And so we see in this whole story of the breakdown of American Christianity in 1920 and beyond. And by the way, the Scopes Monkey trial comes 5 years after that, right? It was, Clarence Darrow is prosecuted in the state of Tennessee for teaching evolution in 1925. This is immediately following the fundamentalist modernist split of 1920. And I don't think that's accidental at all.
Right.
And on the one hand, the evangelicals won in court, but they lost in the court of public opinion. And it was really at that point that American fundamentalism or evangelicalism becomes very strongly anti-intellectual or anti-rational.
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say that I'm embracing Darwin's theory of evolution. I think there's some issues with it, but it is to say that the evangelical world withdrew from the public square and really ceased to engage in the conversation with wider society. And so it was left to the pagans, and it was left to the liberal Christians, but the evangelicals went away and prayed and continued to preach the gospel to whoever would listen. And so that's a little bit of historical retrospective. Well, we're in a comparable situation right now, because here we are in 2021. It's been 101 years now since that split of 1920. It's been 101 years. And, the kind of conservative, evangelical, charismatic, third wave wing of the church may be represented by groups like Bethel, Kansas City, Morning Star, Charisma Magazine, Sid Roth. I don't know. I could throw some others on there, but I'm not calling anyone out here. I'm just trying to give people markers that identify with this kind of conservative end of the church. That's one group of people, and probably
in there too. You've got you kind of mentioned all the charismatics, but you've got the Presbyterians, the Southern Baptists.
Yeah.
All of those. Those
not all Presbyterians, right? Some Presbyterians are quite liberal.
I can't ever remember if it's PUSA or UPC. I don't remember. One of them was pretty conservative. One of them was pretty
right.
Liberal. Right.
So the ones, the Presbyterian seminaries that would easily identify with this wing that I've just described would be groups like RTS, Reformed Theological Seminary. I think Gordon Conwell is not strictly a Presbyterian seminary, but they draw heavily from the Presbyterian Church. So Gordon Conwell, Fuller used to be this way, but Fuller's undergone some changes, and a lot of people aren't really sure where they fit in the map these days, but they used to be on that end.
But either way, we're seeing a divide again.
Right.
Right. Of liberal, fundamentalists.
Right.
And so we're here now, and you're saying that it's time for something different.
That's correct. Yeah. That's exactly it. By the way, just to finish the thought, so when we think about the liberal wing of things, Union Theological Seminary, Harvard Divinity School, probably Princeton Theological Seminary, there's a few conservatives around there, but the predominant lean to that seminary is liberal. There would be others that we could name. And again, we're back to the same denominational names that I threw out. The United Presbyterian Church is certainly in the liberal camp. The Episcopal Church of the United States, for sure that would be in that camp. The United Methodist Church and some of the other Methodist denominations, most of them would be in that liberal camp. And so we see this sort of further dividing out. And I would say that in most cases, the liberal side, they don't believe in the exclusivity of Jesus. They don't believe that it's necessary to believe in him unto salvation to be saved. They would probably deny the reality of hell across the board. The idea of anything supernatural as we understand that would be largely dismissed as fallacies and relics of an ancient worldview that ought to be discarded. They would be very heavily oriented towards social themes and memes that are, front and center in our society today. And I think it's safe to say that the vast majority of people in that kind of liberal wing of the camp, they would name themselves as Christians, but they also would have been people who voted for Biden. And so you can see that Trump-Biden divide going on along the question of, are you a conservative Christian or a liberal Christian? And so,
and even that has wreaked havoc amongst the conservatives, because you had, I would say half the conservatives said, how can we vote for Trump because of, things that he's done, things that he's said. And so it's even more splintered now.
That's right.
Than even before. And then on the liberal side, I think a lot of it boils down to, sexual ethics, and that's sort of the line in the sand that they seem to draw, based on those two things. So, but conservatives haven't done that great with sexual ethics either. We may have preached, about against homosexuality, but boy, there's been a lot of controversy in that camp too, as far as the failings of the leaders of that group as well. So here we sit in a very splintered state. I think is there's no way around it, and the church is hurting, but luckily it's Jesus's bride, and so I think he's going to pull through, and I think that's what you're sort of leading us into, is this idea of how is it going to happen? What do we need to do? So what do we do, Ken? What do we need to see?
Well, Jesus said that the world would know we are Christians because we love each other. And, he prayed in his high priestly prayer that we be brought into perfect unity, just as you, Father, and I are one, when he was praying to the Father. So what I've painted is not a particularly unified picture.
No.
And so I think this is part of our malaise as the people of God, is that we are not unified. And remember, I was calling out kind of the need for, on the conservative side, there are a few things that the liberals have that we really need to adopt, and there's a few things that we have that the liberals need to adopt. But maybe we are just like 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel in the long run. And so there will continue to be enduring differences. But the long and short of it is that in our time, Christianity is dying in the Western world. And I really appreciated William's perspective when we had him on the show, because, he's a revivalist, and he is seeing things happen in moves of God. And I think for a lot of people, it's a discouraging time to be a Christian, because we find that our beliefs are often under pressure in the public square. Things that we hold dear, even the very definition of marriage, or what is a human being, male and female, what does that mean? Can that be redefined at will? All of these things run contrary to traditional Christian belief and theology. And so we see in this a pretty much a wholesale effort, I would say, on the part of wider secular society to overthrow whatever Christian foundations we may have been built upon. And so as we think about that, and we think about the time of Luther, and we think about Reformation period, I could make the argument that while there was a religious veneer through Catholicism at the time of Luther, Europe perhaps was not truly and authentically converted. It may not have been that strong of a Christian base. It may really have been something that was going through the motions. And so when we think about what does Reformation mean, the first tenet of the Reformation that I think we need in our time comes straight out of the book of Revelation. Jesus appears to John, the Revelator, on Patmos. And when he appears to him, he says, John, I want you to write 7 letters to 7 churches in Asia. And one of those 7 goes to the church of Sardis. And he says to them this: you have a reputation for being alive, but you are dead. Strengthen what is weak and is about to die. And I would say that in our time, Christianity in the Western world, not just America, but the whole of the Western world is dead. but has a reputation of being alive. What do I mean by that? Well, if you go to Islamic lands, if you go to Israel, which isn't Islamic, it's Jewish, if you go to, I don't know, China, if you go to India, if you go to most of Africa, they still look at Europe and America, and by extension, Australia, New Zealand, and much of South America. They look at these societies and they view us as the Christian West. And that might have been true once upon a time, but I'm not sure it's true right now. There's not a lot that I agree with of Barack Obama's sayings, but he made a statement in one of his speeches during his presidency: America is no longer a Christian nation. Well, I think it's supposed to be, and I think there are still a lot of Christians here, but I think that our distinctiveness, our saltiness, if you want to use Jesus's language, has diminished considerably. And so as you look across Europe, England is probably the most Christian of all the countries in what we used to call Western Europe. And in England today, there's a little over 1% of the population who go to church. If you go to countries like Spain, France, Italy, Greece, I mean, Greece is, one of the places where Paul had a lot of his ministry. Italy, Spain, France. France is called the mother of the church. Italy is, of course, the site of the Vatican itself. Spain was the site of Spanish Catholicism, very strong bulwark of Catholic Christianity. And in none of these countries does more than 1% of the population go to church. People just don't go. Christianity has been bypassed and become irrelevant.
I think to clarify, because if you're in the business, you kind of use this speak about going to church. And so I hear some pushback on that a lot of times, but we're not saying you go to church and then you're a Christian, but we're saying that typically exemplifies the Christian life. That's kind of how we measure things, is that, don't forsake the gathering together of the believers. And so that's just sort of when people are doing research, that's sort of the tipping point. So we're not saying
it's an indicator.
Right. Yeah. So
that's a good clarifying point. That's very good. So, but America, we have historically been a very, very Christian nation, and the week of Easter, so early April 2021, George Gallup came out with a new poll. And in that poll, he found that only 47% of Americans identify with a church and count themselves as members of, that particular church, any particular church. Well, you could say we're doing way better than Europe, and yeah, we are, and we might be doing 47 times better, in fact. But the reality is that as recently as 1999, 70% of Americans identified with a particular church, and now they don't. And so the decline from 70% to 47% is 23 percentage points, and that decline has occurred over 22 years. So that's a little over 1% a year, but it's not been a, kind of a linear decline. It's been more like, and then it just went off the cliff. And where it really went off the cliff was around about 2010. That was when the really rapid drop in acceleration began. And it gives rise to two whole groups of peoples that are, readily identifiable by those who study populations and religious trends and things like that. They're known as the nuns and the duns. And when I say nun, I don't mean do not mean, Sally Field with her habit, the flying N-U-N.
Right.
The nuns are the N-O-N-E-S, those who have no religion. And the duns are those who did have Christianity, did have a religion, but they no longer do. They're done with religion, and they've walked away from the faith. And I mean, I know a lot of people like this, and I'm sure many of our listeners know people like this that have just abandoned the faith. They've just gone on, they've moved on. And the nuns and the duns are what are contributing to this drop from 70% down to 47%. And by the way, there is still further decline happening and further acceleration. I don't know where the bottom is. And I do believe that God wants to bring a coming revival. God always moves in times of great darkness and despair. And so again, I was very encouraged by the way William articulated what he is seeing. But as Dwight Eisenhower once said, facts are stubborn things. And so the fact of the matter is we need to recognize that, as Jesus said in this letter to the Sardis church through John the Revelator, you have a reputation for being alive, but you are dead. So we have a reputation in the West of being alive. There's churches everywhere. They're on every street corner. I mean, in your town in particular, Grant, I mean, I was just with you in Nashville. I mean, you can't go a mile down the street and just about every intersection you come to, there's a church on every corner, and they're, traditional churches with big white spires. And, a lot of them are Presbyterian or Baptist or Methodist. There are some newer ones as well, but they don't tend to meet in buildings like that. And so there might be a reputation of being alive. It might appear that we are Christian, but what Jesus is really saying is wake up and smell the coffee, strengthen what is weak and is about to die. And I think that's really our first mandate in this new Reformation, is those basic principles and tenets of the faith that have been abandoned or ignored. And those aren't the same thing. To abandon is a more active thing. I don't believe that anymore. I'm moving away from it. To ignore it is just to say, I'm changing the emphasis. Yeah, we believe that, but that's not our thing these days. Jesus says, strengthen that which is weak and is about to die. So it's time to reinvest in the core doctrines of Christianity. It's time to reinvest in the core lifestyle issues of Christianity. It's time to reinvest in being engaged, to be salt and light. It's time to re-engage with a whole host of things, some of which we're going to talk about in future podcasts dealing with this new Reformation. But we have to do that, because if we don't, the church will actually die. And I think we would be remiss if we were simply to say glibly, well, Jesus said the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, so we don't need to do anything. It's all going to be good in the end. Just trust the process. I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's time for us as the people of God to realize, wow, we're in a bad state, and begin calling out to God collectively to rescue us from going off the cliff.
Right. And a lot of times in the West, we're pretty myopic in our view. I mean, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, and the church is doing great in a lot of places. I mean, you want to talk about revival and harvest. I mean, look at Iran. It's going gangbusters over there. So Jesus's bride is doing pretty good. We're just not representing that well, here. And, the thing about gates is move. And so for them not to prevail against the church, it insinuates that the church is moving towards the gates of hell to go and set the captives free and deliver people from the hell that they're living in. And so, I see a lot of churches pretty camped far away from that, of engaging into that sort of, normal Christian activity that we're supposed to be engaged in.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's certainly, this is a particularly Western problem that we're talking about, and so it's important for us to recognize that.
That's correct. Yeah. And there's a saying in the military, and it would be true in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force: you can't really fight until you know where you are. Because if you don't know where you are, you can't orient to where you're trying to get to. You can't even define your objectives, really. And so this thing of wake up, strengthen what is weak and is about to die, that Jesus speaks to the church of Sardis. I think it's important for us, no matter where we are in this spectrum of Christianity as we've described it, it's important for all of us to wake up and to realize that on some level, the American experiment is a Christian experiment. Those who founded this country were trying to create a society that would, on many levels, be a city on a hill. And it would be a light to the nations, and it would seek to embody the best of Christian ideals. Now, in a lot of ways, we fell short. I think one of the most serious of all was that we allowed slavery to exist when we framed the Constitution. Some of the founding fathers had reservations about it. It should have been disallowed from the get-go. That would have prevented much of the difficulty we're experiencing at this time. It was a mistake. It was a big mistake. I'm not trying to just push it aside and say, "Oh, don't worry about it." But notwithstanding that, is what I really want to say. They were still, in every other area, doing their best as fallen human beings to capture and embody the principles of Christianity and to enflesh them into a government. Another one, by the way, that would have fallen into this area would have been the differential treatment of men versus women. And this is why we have all of the upheaval around women's suffrage, again, in that same time period, the 1920s, that would have been roughly 150 years after the founding of the country. It was an unresolved issue, and so it became an issue. And then, we can think of the way the U.S. handled the Native Americans as we expanded westward. It was inevitable that there was going to be conflict between the two different societies, one of which was a hunter-gatherer, essentially Neolithic society, and the other was a much more modern industrialized society. I mean, never mind the ideology behind these two civilizations. The technology alone meant that there was going to be a differential, and that in the end, the society that was driven by the European settlers would prevail purely on a technological basis.
And
The
this,
ideology may have been wrapped around it to legitimize it, but it was, I think, more of a technological conflict than anything.
right. And so I think it's important too for us to recognize, a lot of what we're seeing bubbling up in society right now is sort of a reckoning of those failings.
That's right.
And rightfully so in so many ways. I mean, you look at the slaughter of Native Americans, potentially in the name of Jesus. You look at slavery and chattel slavery,
Right.
In our country, potentially, and some people in the name of Jesus. I mean, there's a lot of preachers preaching about how slaves should act to their masters. It was just crazy. You have continued segregation and institutionalized racism up until last century. Continued oppression against women and their rights. And what I always, you hear people, I'm a little younger than you, and you hear people, we always pine for what was in our lives, the glory days. And I would hear people, my parents, my grandparents talking about, boy, when things used to be great. And we used to, Christians were in charge, and it was like, man, your good old days was someone's hell on earth. And you're coming at it from a particularly white middle-class experience when, that person's grandmother was actually, they couldn't drink from the same water fountain. They couldn't swim in the same pool. And so we are sort of reckoning with this Christian experiment right now. And, one wonders, would it have just been better to left Jesus out of the equation altogether and say, okay, we're going to do a new country so we don't have to be ruled by a king. And hey, we're Christians as well. You know what I mean? It's just, there's so much here. Can you hear me? I'm on. We're having some technical difficulties. You're back?
I'm here. I never went anywhere.
Me either. So we'll keep.
The last thing I heard you say was, so we don't have to be ruled by a king.
Right. And so, there is that reckoning that we're in, that we're all feeling very uncomfortable with, because on the one hand, yes, there are Christian principles that we're trying to get back into culture. But on the other hand, we have fallen short in so many ways.
Right.
And brought Jesus's name into that mix, which is extremely unfortunate. And so I think we've fallen out of favor in that way as well, culturally, is they've looked at us like you're saying, and you have a reputation of being alive, but man, so much rotting dead meat within the body,
That's right. And unfortunately, we still run into pockets of it from time to time. And I might add, it's on the right and on the left. It's not just, what they call the Christian right. The Christian left has its own issues. They're just different issues.
That's right.
So we have to strengthen what is weak and is about to die. And that's where it begins. Well, honestly, I think we've probably run out of time. We've talked enough today. There's so much more to say. So, in coming weeks, we'll unpack some more of the principles of the new Reformation. But I think just laying the groundwork and talking about the critical importance of strengthening that what is weak and returning to our first principles, that's probably enough for us to say today.
I agree, but let's don't. We've talked about how terrible everything is.
Yeah.
I think people could use a testimony or two that God is actually still moving, and he's actually still having his way on the earth, and the Holy Spirit is working in power. And so Ken, do you have a recent testimony for us that God is actually still on the throne, despite all of this stuff that's going on?
Well, I have a couple that come to mind immediately. One occurred 2 weeks ago. I was in Orange County, California, and a woman came forward for prayer. She had been in debilitating pain for 31 years, undiagnosable. She'd been bedridden for 20 of those 31 years, but the last few years she'd been a little better and could get out of bed and get around. She'd been married at one point, and her husband knew she had some, physical limitations when he married her. But when he left her, he said, "I had no idea that it was as bad as it was. I just can't live with this." So she lost her marriage over this. She came forward at the end of my sermon and requested prayer. A friend had brought her, and the Spirit of God came on her, and she was healed of all of her pain. Wow. After 31 years. And, she fell on the floor. Initially, she kind of slumped. I said, "You better get a chair." They brought a chair. We put her in the chair. She fell out of the chair onto the floor, and laid in kind of an ecstatic state, a state of reverie, you might say, for, I don't know, maybe it was 20 minutes or so. I wasn't really timing it, but that's about what it seemed to me. And, presently she got up and left, but as she left, I kind of caught her eye, and she was completely pain-free after 31 years and has continued to be pain-free. So she got her life back. That's an indication of the mercy of God. That's an indication that God cares enough about somebody with their distress and affliction, the lost marriage. I mean, all these things. And of course, one could say, well, why didn't God do something sooner? I mean, it's kind of 31 years too late. And actually, sometimes we don't know the answer to those questions. We literally just don't know. It speaks in the Gospel of John of a man who'd been born blind.
Right.
And he'd spent his entire life blind. And when Jesus encounters him, he's 38 years old. And when he gets healed, nobody can believe that it's actually him, because they're like, well, that guy's blind. We know he's blind. So what are you talking about that, this man Jesus healed you? And then they say, well, and the Pharisees say, well, gosh, we know this guy, he's a sinner. And he goes, well, sinner or not, what I know is this: I was blind and now I see. Mm-hmm. So this story of this woman with her pain would be its own analog to that story. It's not an identical story, but it has a lot of features like that, with the long-term suffering and the kind of incomprehensible mystery of why it took that long for God to arrive on scene. I think the right answer is not to question God for why he took so long, but rather just to thank him that he did something at all.
Yeah, for sure.
And then another story, and it's right on this theme of reconciliation and unity. At breakfast this morning, we were talking about a guy who got called out in the meeting last night, and he was an Irishman. And during this time of difficulty in Ireland, when we had the Protestants against the Catholics, there'd been a group that had come from the Republic of Ireland, which is Southern Ireland, and it's heavily Catholic. And then there'd been a group that had come from Northern Ireland, which tends to be Protestant and is associated with Great Britain, and is a kind of a holding of Great Britain. And anyone who knows the history of especially the latter 20th century, it was a heavily militarized area. There was a great deal of conflict, explosions, violence, and so on. Anyway, these two groups of Christians came. They were from the same movement. Some came from Northern Ireland, some came from the Irish Republic, and there was extreme distrust among these Christians that were in this meeting, even though they were part of the same movement.
Right.
And early in the meeting, one of the people had said to one of the leaders who was there to kind of oversee and facilitate this conference event that they were holding, this woman had said, "I've never had the other side apologize to me for all that they've done and all the violence and all the difficulty they've wrought on our family." And when the first session began that night, the kind of opening session, someone from the other side had the stage and got up, and he had himself been a policeman in Northern Ireland and had been maimed by the explosion of a bomb that he was diffusing as part of the British occupying force. He'd recovered and could move and was, functioning again, but he bore the scars on his body of that explosion that the Irish nationalists from the South had planted in Northern Ireland. And, he moved with great difficulty and pain because of the injuries he'd sustained in that explosion. He got up to speak and he said, I had my notes prepared, but I think what I need to do is just, I need to do something different. And then he points at the woman who had been speaking to the facilitator, not knowing about that conversation.
Yeah.
And he said, would you come up here, please? And so the woman came up and he said, I want to apologize for all that our side has done to your side in this conflict. Will you please forgive me? Well, if you didn't catch it, this is the woman who had said only a few hours before, I've never been apologized to for all that side did to our people. So she breaks down sobbing, falls into his arms, and the whole room just splits open and everybody is weeping and sobbing because of this reconciliation. So when we talk about the kingdom of God, there is a dimension to it that's more than just healing or miracles. There is a dimension of reconciliation and unity among those who have previously had no unity. And I think this is really in the center of what Paul is talking about. Here, there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. We could say in our time, black nor white, but Christ is all and in all. And so there is a dimension of this kind of social healing and reconciliation that I think the church could have a very large voice in if we'd belly up to the bar and get after it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
By the way, in that exchange, the wounded, injured guy who had been maimed in the explosion was himself healed through that exchange. So the kingdom came in multiple dimensions, right? It was the healing of that woman and all that she needed in hearing an apology. It was his bodily healing. It was the healing of the separation between all the delegates in the conference. And then in the aftermath of that, there was a huge move of God that broke out in that city. And everybody who knew about it said, surely it was because we got to the place of unity.
Wow. I mean, it's what he said. It's the ball game. That may we be one as he and the Father are one. And we're a long way from one, but it does start with us. It starts, it's easy to pontificate outside.
That's right. That's right.
I think for us, as we're leaving this, and we're going to pick up this conversation probably multiple times throughout the rest of this year, I think what we need to have is our own reckoning with the Holy Spirit and saying, who am I pointing fingers at? Who am I not forgiving? All of that. And it does start with us.
Who have I offended? With whom can I be reconciled? What restitution might I myself need to make? I mean, there's a lot of dimensions to that. And by the way, when I say I myself, that's deliberate. I'm aware of some of the moves underway to try to do reparations, societal, restoration. Maybe there's a place for that at times. Maybe it just becomes another one of these political sloganeering things. But the one thing we know we can do is we can always control ourselves. We can always manage ourselves. So before you ever go around talking about we need to do this as a society, stop and think about who have I offended? Who have I wronged? With whom can I go be reconciled? And do I myself need to engage in some sort of restorative act with that individual?
Have we cheated
those group of people that I mean, own it for yourself before you ever start talking about some big social program.
Well, this is what Jesus says, right? Is if you go to the altar and to offer your sacrifice, but you have something against, leave it, get out of there. And I wonder, in this last 20, 30 years, we've had so many full altars. And I wonder how many of those actually had offenses counted towards them and towards others. And maybe instead of filling the altars, we need to fill the streets and start to do some reconciliation of our own.
Yeah.
That sounds good. Well, Ken, you get to your thing. I'm going to get to my thing today. And this was great. And this is a great, I think part 1A, 1B of what we're going to talk about. But it's the issue of the time.
Right.
And it's going to take a while to flesh this out. And so, these are just things to think of, because people just spout off all the time, but we're really deep diving into what it means for us to actually see life returned to the church. So thanks so much for taking time. And I'm looking forward to picking this conversation back up wherever you're at, wherever I'm at next time.
All right.
All right. Thank you, Ken.
Bless you. See you later.